Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the show. If you could save $400,000 a year in medical costs just by making a radical change to your diet, would you do it? Today we're here with Brett Ender and Harry Gray, fellow Austinites, former college athletes turned entrepreneurs, and hosts of the Meat Mafia podcast. From fitness to faith, we cover a lot of ground in this one, and I hope you enjoy. Quick note before we get to the interview with Brett and Harry. If you'd like to stay up to date about our upcoming challenges, as well as opportunities to work with me one-on-one, make sure you're signed up for the newsletter at abeljames.com. That's A-B-E-L James.com. You can also sign up for my Substack at abeljames.substack.com or shoot me a DM. I'm a little slow to respond on some social platforms, but you can find me under Abel James or Abel Jams on most social media networks, and I always love hearing from you. All right, in this episode with Brett and Harry, you're about to hear how Brett saved $400,000 a year by making a radical change to his diet, the power of lifestyle interventions over medication, strategies to compete as low-carb ultra-endurance athletes, how to balance entrepreneurial pursuits with athletic ambitions, and much, much more. Let's hang out with Brett and Harry. Welcome back, folks. Today we're here with Brett Ender and Harry Gray, co-hosts of the Meat Mafia podcast, co-founders of Noble Origins, and a pair of competitive low-carb ultra-endurance athletes. Brett, Harry, thanks so much for being here with us.
Abel, pleasure to be here, and thanks for having us, dude.
Abel, I didn't realize how good your podcasting voice was until you kicked that off, man. You got a good voice.
Sometimes I keep it close to the chest. But you guys are crushing it with your podcast and kind of coming on the scene with some incredible energy in a time that we really need these conversations to happen, especially around what we're eating, what we shouldn't be eating, and how we live. But I want to start with a little bit of your background, because one thing that I've noticed, and I'm sure you have as well, is a lot of folks who played college ball or were really involved in sports. Some of them do exceedingly well after school, in crushing it in business or in life, maintaining their peak performance or some level of performance in athletics. And then other ones, just a few years after playing pro ball are 400 pounds, completely lost and broke. So I'm curious for you guys, what has led you on this path, and what is kind of something that maybe other people who used to be involved in athletics can learn from that sort of experience?
So Brett and I played college baseball together. That's how we know each other. I grew up playing a number of different sports. I think ultimately when you do play sports and make it to the collegiate level, playing competitively, you have big aspirations, and that's really like a core part of your identity up until that point. You're 18, 20 years old, and all you're doing is playing sports, focused on getting better in that realm. And it can take up really just like all of your vision for like what you want to do. And so on the other side of that, there's definitely challenges that you have to overcome. And so I think for myself, anyone who's listening to this who's an ex-college athlete, you've been blessed with just the ability to focus on a craft and focus on mastery, which I think is such a core part of being successful. Like, there's such a gift in just pursuing one thing and learning how to become really, really proficient at it. And I think athletics just teaches you so many different aspects of mastery, and also mastery in the context of a team sport. So I think just like taking that and carrying that forward, you aren't necessarily always going to be playing the sport that you love, but the context being like you've learned how to master something, and you've learned how to be in the top 1% of 1% of people in a certain realm. So although there will probably be challenging times, and I'm sure it'll look different for everybody else. Like for me, I stopped playing actually after my sophomore season, and dealt with it like during college, really. So I was just trying to, do basically everything and anything to figure out what I wanted to do next. And it took me years to really figure out what that looked like. And ultimately, it was coming back to the health and wellness space where I found that true passion. But I think it takes time. Not everyone makes that transition smoothly. And for me, it was just trying to get as many reps in as possible across the board, and just try to put that creative energy and that passion that I had for sports into something else as quickly as possible. And it might always not look pretty, but I think on the other side, you will eventually find something that you can put your heart and soul into.
Love that.
Mm. Yeah, and Abel, I would say just to piggyback off Harry, I think between, the origins of you with the Fat Burning Man and us with the Meat Mafia and Noble Origins, our supplement company, I think the three of us have taken the approach of not necessarily being the specialist in the space, more of like the curious outsider that,
Yeah.
whether it was you trying to lose some weight or it was me trying to heal ulcerative colitis, coming at it from the perspective of, we don't come from traditional medicine. You're not a registered nutritionist or a dietitian or a strength and conditioning coach, but you've put in a lot of iterations and you've gone down the rabbit hole of alternative health because you're so desperate for answers that maybe your traditional doctor isn't giving you. And that was the category that I found myself in as a senior in college. I just got really sick entering my senior year of college. And even though I was performing at a high level from a baseball perspective, that was purely geared towards performance. But from a health perspective, I was binge drinking, I was eating a lot of processed foods, I wasn't sleeping great, and I was also chronically stressed out, and just found my large intestine getting to this really inflamed state to the point where I, was just constantly going to the bathroom. My life became dependent around being around a toilet. Got diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, and then immediately got put on a ton of drugs and medication that cost $400,000 a year. And my doctor wasn't talking to me about diet and lifestyle intervention, and I just thought I was going to be on these drugs for the rest of my life. Flash forward a few years into the future after I graduated, I started to hear about, Sean Baker and a lot of these incredible OG carnivore practitioners, the Mark Sissons of the world, who I know you've interviewed on your podcast before. And honestly, just going down the Reddit rabbit hole, I was finding all of these people that had similar autoimmune diseases that they were told were incurable. They were gravitating towards these diet and lifestyle levers and curing themselves. And my doctor this whole time is telling me that it's not curable. And so that kind of gave me proof of concept that the body is this amazing self-healing machine. I just haven't been giving it the right fuel and the right inputs. And, doing the carnivore diet fairly strict for 2 years completely changed my life. And I ended up getting off all the drugs and medication, cured the terrible bloating and gassiness and dependency going to the bathroom. And now looking back in 2024, I really feel like I'm in the best shape of my life. And so that was a huge focal point for Harry and I to start the show. Was we feel like the reason why we're here in this metabolic health crisis is very complex, but the systems and the answers for how we can get out of it are actually very simple. And so we take that kind of informed consumer approach to the show, and that fascination with trying to put out the best information possible in a very simple manner has always fueled both of us.
I love that. For you, Brett, did you go from like 0 to 100 as far as the carnivore thing goes, or did you kind of like dip your toes into it and experiment at first? What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I just remember I had this feeling of, I think I had listened to enough shows and seen enough people give their testimony. And this was back in 2019. So the carnivore diet was definitely more of a fringe movement, but there was enough of a body of work around, people that had been experimenting with this particular approach to eating for an extended period of time, and they were getting results that I wasn't having.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, I was getting biologic infusions that I would get an infusion hooked up into my forearm every 8 weeks. And I just didn't want to live a life that was dependent on these drugs and medications and these infusions. So I don't want to say I hit a point of desperation. It was more of just extreme vigor around, what if I go all in on this thing and I actually can reverse these symptoms? How good would my life be? How much potential am I ultimately leaving on the table? So from day one, I remember I was living in Manhattan at the time, going to the Whole Foods on the Upper East Side, loading up on steak and ground beef, chicken thighs, butter, beef tallow, bone broth, and just sticking to that group of 5 or 6 foods for the better part of 2 years. But pretty much within the first week, I had like dramatic success with the diet. Like I could feel the inflammation leaving. I felt the energy. My quality of thought was so good. Any anxious thoughts kind of just got eradicated. And once you get that first hit of how good you could feel by using the right fuel, there's really no going back at that point. And just the more that I learned, the more I experimented, the more all in that I went. And that was just the approach that I took, and it worked really well for me.
And what does that look like now?
It's a good question, man. And I would say that I ultimately consider the carnivore diet to be an incredible tool. And I think that's polarizing within the carnivore community to say. And I do think there is some psychology around. I think we love getting married to these tribes. Like outside of religion, I think dietary tribes is like secondary to religion in terms of how we self-identify.
Mhm.
I don't think that the arguments like warring against vegetables and fruits are responsible for why we're so metabolically broken as a country. I think Harry and I agree that it's the fact that 63% of all calories are coming in the form of ultra processed foods in the US. So, now that I have a permeable gut, I just stick to single ingredient real foods that are protein dominant. So I would say 80% of my calories a day are coming in the form of animal protein. I throw in some rice, some potatoes, some fruit, some vegetables. Like my girlfriend loves cooking steak and vegetables. And I feel like I'm permeable enough where I can actually digest and inherit a lot of those amazing micronutrients. So I'm trying not to, I think in the past I was shaming myself for eating those foods. And now I've just found that, there's a lot of beauty to combining all these different amazing food groups and still be protein dominant. And I would say I'm still fairly low carb, where it's like 150 grams of carbs a day, but I'm not counting much just because I know if I'm eating those foods, my body's metabolizing it the right way. And I've just built up so much intuition over the last 5 years.
Yeah, it's incredible how divisive this whole diet culture can be. Whether you're talking about vegan or carnivore or anything in between, people get very, very tribal about all of this, and not necessarily in a good way. It can be empowering, and I think community building around all of this is super important. But at the same time, you shouldn't be kicked out of the tribe for eating a vegetable from time to time. Like, we need to get our priorities straight. And so kudos to you guys for talking about animal-based eating and doing that responsibly and regenerative agriculture and all of that, but also not saying that this is the only answer. Everyone else is completely wrong, because I think for a lot of people out there, I mean, if we look at the real problems, the vast majority of people are sick, uninformed, uneducated, or just don't think that eating this way, or kind of eating real food, is worth it or will get the results. So, Harry, what was your background as far as that goes? I know that I've heard you say back in the day you weren't necessarily eating super clean as an athlete, and you can kind of get away with a lot more when you're younger and going to practice every day and that sort of thing. But what did that look like for you?
Yeah, totally. I started getting dialed in with my health when I started taking sports more seriously. So I started training when I was like 14. Really going to this gym. I grew up just outside DC, going to this gym in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, called Prospects. They had some of the best trainers in the country. And so, like from a training perspective, I felt like I was really getting the best I could possibly get at that age and that point in time. I was going there almost every day, like either um, practicing baseball, getting like working on my skills, or training in the gym. But I definitely was not focused on what I was eating. And so, like, at home, my mom was putting good food on the table. But when I want to go to school, I would just eat. I would eat everything, like nachos, cookies, chips, sandwiches, like literally whatever was at the cafeteria at school, I was hammering. And so, I'm a bigger guy, 6'4". At the time, I was like, 210, 220. And I could totally get away with it because I was training a ton. I'm young, and it didn't really show up in any other way other than, you know, my hormones were definitely struggling. I saw that in the form of like cystic acne, dealt with that for a bit in high school. And that was like 100% dietary related. And so for me, I didn't really start tinkering with my diet until college. Started going down the paleo rabbit hole, got into Tim Ferriss's stuff, really got into like the slow carb diet and all that, and saw some like incredible gains in the gym and on the field, and was just feeling so good. Like I had teammates who were not focused on that stuff, and me and one other guy were just getting super dialed in with nutrition and just saw those benefits. And then as soon as I stopped playing ball, my training schedule was locked in. I was eating pretty well. And then as I got into the workforce, like I just noticed my lifestyle shifted so much, where I was so much more sedentary. I wasn't active during the day. I was sitting at a desk all day, and like quickly, um, without really much observation from myself, started seeing that my diet was shifting as well. Even though I was trying to eat the right things, I either like wasn't eating enough protein and started eating a lot more processed foods because I was never satiated. And that just like led to this slow drip of just like, every few months, just, getting a little bit slower, a little bit more brain fog, not sleeping as well. And then 3, 4 years in, I was like, oh man, I really got to like get back to it. And I wasn't like crazy out of shape or anything, but it's one of those things where when you come from being like in peak shape to anything off of that, you realize it pretty quickly. So during COVID, I started experimenting similar to Brett with carnivore, keto, and just my body reacted so well to it. I got amazing sleep, like realized that my energy levels were way off before because they rebounded to this incredible level. Cognitive performance was great. So I just saw quickly like how much can shift in a matter of, I think within 3 weeks, I had probably lost like 10 pounds, was sleeping amazing, waking up with great energy. And all it took was just a few tweaks. Really, I wasn't even going to the gym because it was during COVID. I was just going outside, hitting long walks, cooking all my meals, and prioritizing animal based foods. And then that just got a little bit more. I just kept experimenting a little bit more and a little bit more and saw how impactful it was for myself. And at that point, Brett and I had started getting back into contact and just really obsessing over this stuff again, wanting to sign up for some endurance races together. And both of us just felt this call to really just dive into this stuff even more. I think once you get that personal story of even a slight transformation like myself, which was ultimately like losing 20 pounds, feeling great, getting back into playing shape. It's like once you feel that, you just want to spread it to people because in your 20s, it's very easy to just slide back down the hill, chalk everything up as aging and you slowing down a bit. But really, I think it's inspiring seeing guys like Paul Saladino, Mark Sisson, who are, I wouldn't call them old by any means. The way they live their lives, they act like they're like 20 years old. So, just seeing them further down the road in the way that they're living their life and being super active, I find that incredibly inspiring. And like, that's the life I want to ultimately live. So, realizing that, I was like, I'm going all in on this health stuff. This is where my passion has been for a long time, and just kind of realized that, the corporate stuff wasn't for me anymore. And that was really the start of Brett and I just going all in on everything.
Amazing. What about starting the podcast? I'm curious because there was this huge kind of like wave of new podcasters, say 4 or 5 years ago, certainly throughout the pandemic. And a lot of that was just kind of like becoming Zoom literate, right? Like before that, it was having a video-based podcast with audio as well. It's a huge challenge getting a lot of these like authors and scientists and other people who aren't like influencers or really on the internet to like be able to set up a webcam and like be in front of it and have an internet connection. That was really hard. In the years since, obviously, it's completely different now, but we had this huge like flood of new podcasters, and 80 or 90% of them like didn't make it. They're not still doing the show. So I'm curious about, for you guys, like your passion is obvious. Your show is amazing. What is it that has allowed you to kind of like keep going, double down, and stay hungry?
Yeah, it's such a good question, man. And I think our timing was fortunate because we recorded our first episode of the Meat Mafia podcast in 2022. So we kind of had the 2 years for these scientists and professors to figure out how to navigate Zoom and Google Hangout and Rodecaster and all these platforms that you've seen since you've been doing this for 13 years, which is so cool, the stories you probably have. But before we ever recorded a podcast, we actually had a pretty nice Twitter following that we built up quickly. And a lot of brands or creators don't think about Twitter first. It's easy to think, oh, Instagram or TikTok or YouTube. Harry and I we actually found kind of like these hidden gifts as writers. And so what we did for the first 6 months is we just told these stories about the food system. We talked about the demonization of saturated fat, told the story of Ansel Keys, Earl Butz, industrial agriculture, processed food consumption. We just told these stories really well over written form. And that grew our Twitter following pretty sizably, so that when we decided, hey, written content is great, but if we want to have the largest impact that we can, we should probably really talk to the experts that we've learned from, that we're kind of basing a lot of our content off of. And because we had consumed this stuff for probably 4 years prior to ever launching the brand, we just had so many questions. So it was really organic because we were just reaching out to the people that we had looked up to, that we had learned from for years, and just asking the questions that we wanted to know. And number two, hey, when we were just getting started 4 years ago and we could have asked these people direct questions, what would we have asked them? What would have been what's the most useful question to our audience? And that's really all we did. And I think people would be surprised, because the biggest question we used to get was, how are you getting these big guests like Sean Baker or Ken Berry on your podcast when you're so small? I think most people forget the value of a really nice, thoughtful, cold DM written to someone and just persistent follow-up. And, I think people would be shocked if you send enough really thoughtful DMs that show that you really care about the person you want to have on your show. 8 times out of 10, I think they'd actually say yes to you, because, if you're asking someone like Sean to coffee, it's fairly transactional. He's not getting benefit out of it. But even if your podcast is small, you're giving him a free piece of digital content. We're creating clips for him that he can use for social media. And also, a lot of people do want to help as well. So we just really leaned into that. And I think and what Harry and I consciously said was, hey, we've never done a podcast before. We need to get a lot of reps in, because we're kind of going from off the couch. So we just became the volume guys, and anyone that wanted to record with us, we were doing record with them. And so I think we had a month in June where we did, what was it, Harry, like 35 podcasts in a month in June 2022.
Yeah, we did 35 podcasts in a month. There was one week I think we did nine podcasts, and Brett was still working a full-time job. And the crazy thing was, like, just the early days when Brett and I were just writing on Twitter like fanatically and doing these podcasts fanatically. And Brett has this part of his personality, or once he gets locked in, it's like just he gets into bulldog mode. My calendar was just getting filled up with just podcast guests or podcast guests. I'm like, oh, Brett is on fire. So I think, like, going into something with a blank slate, like Brett and I were, like, we had nothing to lose. And I think, I don't want to say like we were like one of the first podcasts in the virtual setting post-COVID. Well, I mean, we were a part of that group, but I think we might have been like a little bit before like a lot of people got involved. And one of the things I feel like we might have proven out to the people who are paying attention to us, who ultimately ended up starting podcasts, was exactly what Brett said. If you just go after it and show people that you're building something, you can do a lot of it virtually. You can do all of it virtually, and you can connect with amazing people. And so I think we just brought this level of excitement early on, where we just really wanted to get involved in this space and figure it out, and kind of had that nothing to lose mentality. And the show has definitely evolved since then. There's been seasons of it kind of taking different turns and getting more into talking to entrepreneurs as opposed to regenerative farmers or doctors, like maybe what it used to look like. But I think what's kept us going and excited about it is ultimately just like this shared passion between Brett and myself for having these types of conversations. And ultimately, I think that, like, what drives Brett and I the most is this feeling that our culture today is centered around, like, if you take the average person involved in the culture in the West, you're fairly unhealthy. And ultimately, like, maybe not working the job, like not fully passionate about what you're doing. And I think for us, we want to create a culture of people who are incredibly healthy, passionate about what they're doing in life, and going after things that they care about. And ultimately, that stuff just bleeds into, your community and the people around you, which is so important. So we just get excited about that, and just the people that we get to talk to is incredible.
Yeah, having a podcast is one of the most magnificent things ever. Ever. It's not for everyone, obviously. It's not particularly well paid or well rewarded in traditional ways, or at least most podcasts aren't right out of the gate that way. You have to put in serious work. But the idea that you can basically connect with almost anyone, especially people who are at the top of their fields doing really incredible work, and just speak to them for an hour or a few hours, sit down with them, ask whatever you want, and they give you honest answers. Like, it's still amazing to me that this is a thing. It really is. But it's really easy for a lot of folks as well. If you kind of push it too hard, do too many shows, burn yourself out for that passion to kind of fizzle a little bit. And you guys are obviously very curious And that stands out in your interviews. You're great listeners with each other. You play well together. These are things that I think anyone who wants to start a podcast or kind of like start their own thing really need to pay attention to, because it's much more collaborative, ideally, than I think most people would imagine who haven't tried it before. But man, having the ability to reach out to those folks, whether it's virtually or in person, is just a wonderful gift. But let's talk about the in-person thing. What was it about Austin that got you guys here? An incredible place to be for people who are kind of, of our interest and ilk. So I'll let you go. Brett, why don't you start?
Yeah, I would say that what Harry and I had in common is that we were both in these large Northeast metropolitan cities. I was in New York City for about 4 years. Harry was in Boston for a similar stint. And you're going deep into this like alternative health movement, which is somewhat countercultural.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult to find your tribe, right? In both of those cities, like I still get so energized going back to New York for a weekend and just feeling that energy and the fast-paced nature of it. I don't think there's anything like it, but I think we both had this feeling as men in our mid to late 20s at the time that we were just dying to create something. And we just really felt this pull that we needed to do whatever we could to just get in the health and wellness space and just promote the information that we were burning to talk about and try and ultimately turn that into a business that would help make people's lives healthier. And we had just been hearing so much about Austin from some friends that we had, but just also a lot of people that we had consumed content from. The vibe that we were getting is that it was really this renaissance for the health and wellness space. And so Ironman Waco was amazing, that race that we did in 2021, because it allowed us to get an Airbnb in Austin for 3 months, kind of as this like trial experience to see if the city was everything that it lived to. We wanted the city to live up to what it was going to be. Yeah. And I would say we left that experience as a resounding yes, to be honest with you. And I don't think that our show or our brand or whatever we're doing would be nearly the level that it is right now had we not like physically planted ourselves in Austin. It reminds me a lot of Stephen Pressfield's book, Put Your Ass Where Your Heart Wants to Be. So if you want to be in finance, you should be in New York. Mm-hmm. If you want to be in tech, you should be in Silicon Valley. If you want to be in the health and wellness space, you should ultimately be in Austin. And just the serendipity, the connections, whether you're at our gym, whether you're at the podcasting studio, whether you're out at a restaurant, you're just constantly meeting new people and pulling them into your world, and you're getting pulled into their world. And, just to see the spider web of relationships that we've built just by physically being in the city is truly amazing. And I think there's kind of a flavor of everything in Austin, depending on your interests. You can get a taste of that depending on what you're into here.
Yeah, I would add Austin for me was, I had lived in a few different cities, but ultimately worked most of my life in Boston. And so similar to Brett, I think getting to a place where there was a reverence for creativity was really important. And New York definitely has that. Boston, I never really felt it. And part of it was probably because I was working in a totally different realm and different sphere. But getting down to Austin, it was insane. It felt like we were in like a totally different world. Like there was run clubs every day. Each gym had its own personality and character. And, we would meet one person. They would just be like, you've got to meet my group of friends over here. And it was so easy to just get plugged in. Yeah. Brett and I were texting this morning. We were just like, it's truly amazing the amount of people that we've come into contact with in the city of Austin or through the city of Austin. And just the quality of people, the willingness to actually want to help you on whatever path you're on is truly something that I think is really special to Austin. I do feel like there's almost this collaborative nature to the type of person who comes to Austin and is working on things. And so, I just love the city for that. It's gritty. It's got, a little bit of everything, definitely weird, definitely not perfect. But I think for people who are looking to get their start in the health and wellness space, there's truly a renaissance going on right now in Austin, and it's super fun to be a part of.
Yeah, it feels like it. I'm also from the Northeast, grew up in New Hampshire, and worked in DC and Manhattan after college. And even back in 2008 when I moved to Austin, it was kind of like similar vibes, but they're much more aggressively in the health and wellness space than they used to be, and much more aggressively in kind of like the podcasting space. It was always a collection of weirdos, but one of the things I love about it here is that, you know, in the Northeast, you people are like, what do you do? And if you don't say like banking or consulting or like some other job like that, then they're like, what? And down in Austin, like, it's amazing. I remember some of the first friends I had here. I was hanging out for months, like really good friends. And we realized like we've known each other for like 6 months or something like that, hanging out pretty much every week. And none of us had any idea what the other ones did for work. No idea
Wow.
whatsoever. And it's kind of this wonderful collection of weirdos as well that can help normalize people going after their own path, building their own thing, not necessarily prioritizing status or prestige or the things that other people think you should do as much as like following your passions. And so I love what Austin has become. Like you said, it's not perfect, but anyone out there who's listening and kind of on the fence, at least come here and do what Brett and Harry did. Like, try it out for a little bit. Like, rent a house or like just like stay in a hotel for a few days, a few weeks, spend some time here and see what happens. Because it's not just the folks who live here, but it's kind of becoming this hub that also incredible people who don't live here come through on a regular basis. And so if you're looking to build out your own business, your own brand, your own podcast, that sort of thing, I can't imagine a better place to be than this. But let's talk about your athletic pursuits. Why in the world would you grind so hard, especially once you're, you know, post athletics, out of school, that sort of thing, out of competition? What is driving you to go after these, like, at least according to other people, kind of insane goals?
Well, I think we honestly, especially after graduating, I think we start normalizing a lot of things that we shouldn't be normalizing in this country. And I think both of us going to Babson College up in Boston, you just see this trend of like you're done playing baseball and people look back at their time as a 21-year-old as the pinnacle of like physical shape that they'll ever be in. And you immediately get into the happy hour culture, the 9 to 5 lifestyle, you know, processed foods, 2 to 3 beers, you know, martinis, stuff like that. And you look back in 5 years, and a lot of our friends that we went to college with were, you know, 24, 25. And they looked like they were 40-year-old men because they weren't prioritizing themselves. And I know for me, I think it was this fear of, I didn't feel like when I graduated school that I had like tapped into my potential at all. I felt like I actually underachieved relative to my potential as an athlete. And when you're 21, you're still a kid at that point. Like 21 should not be your pinnacle. Like I don't even think most men hit their physical pinnacle until they're 30, 32-ish. So that's a whole decade to tap in. And you're, you know, to think that everything stops at 21 is actually really sad to think about. And so, you know, Harry and I actually weren't in close communication after we graduated. We just found that we were almost both in these like very parallel tracks doing similar things. And for me, I looked at myself in the mirror right after graduating college, and, you know, I was 205, was carrying a lot of inflammation, binge drinking a bunch, eating like crap. And I remember realizing like you love listening to David Goggins and Jocko Willink and all these motivational speakers, but you're not actually following the prescription of what they're telling you to do. You're not waking up early, you're not eating well, you're not going on long runs. And so I just started running on my own when I was living in my parents' house in New Jersey, just to try and get this mental edge and tap into something that I was missing. And I remember going for a 3-mile run on my own for the first time was an amazing accomplishment, because I never even ran 3 miles on my own playing college baseball. And like anything else, you get that initial spark and you're like, all right, well now what could I do if I really apply myself? And so the 3-mile run turns into a, you know, 6-mile run and a 10-mile run. You sign up for your first half marathon and your marathon. And then next thing you know, Harry and I are doing an Ironman together, which was like the backbone of our basis, the basis for our entire business. And so I'll let Harry speak for himself, but we've kind of found this cool thing of putting one big endurance challenge on the calendar that really scares you and primes the pump. And, you know, a little bit of fear and excitement is a good thing. And I think it just helps you sharpen the axe physically so you can sharpen the axe with our business as well too. And I hope that that's you know, a tradition that we continue to carry on of like one big pursuit a year.
Cool.
Yeah. I think back to just a moment in time where Brett and I were both, you know, still living in the Northeast. We were kind of really just getting reacquainted as friends. Like, um, as Brett said, we weren't incredibly close in college. He was a year younger than me. I had stopped playing when he had gotten on the team, so it was really after school when we got close. And I think both of us really had this feeling that we had a lot of potential left on the bone after playing sports in college, and realizing that we had let some things, opportunities squander, and lost focus, and not being concentrated on the things that we knew in our hearts that we wanted to do. And so I think the endurance races were really much more of like a spiritual awakening than they were a physical or mental test, even though they were absolutely physical and mental challenges. I think they were really just like events for us to really push ourselves to a place that we knew we could get to, and really just waking up that spirit of like, hey, you guys have so much that you're capable of doing. All it takes is a vision and the work to just actually go out and pursue it. And so I think there was probably a bit of just like seeking that feeling of going after something really big that was a void after sports.
Mhm.
And ultimately we knew that we had something on the other side of sports, the corporate life, and then us getting into entrepreneurship. We knew there was going to be something big for us there. It was really, I think, the endurance stuff that really pulled us in the direction of having that mindset and that spirit that, hey, we're capable of doing this stuff. We can do it. And I think both of us just are cut from a similar cloth in that sense. And yeah, just love the feeling of finding the edge and continuing to push.
What about fueling for that? Are you just slamming T-bones, or what does that look like for
Yeah, I think that when we were training, we would stick to a fairly like low carbohydrate approach, and then actually like incorporate carbohydrates and things like that during the races themselves. I think like the common philosophy was that, hey, we're at the start line. Now all we're trying to do is just engineer the outcome that we want. So, and the problem too with the endurance space up until recently is like a lot of these gels are just sugar bombs, to be honest with you, and they're really disruptive to the gut. Now there's new brands like Honey Plus where it's just organic, raw honey, electrolytes. There's some really cool alternatives out there, but I've never done this. Actually be pretty cool because we've had people on the podcast. I've never done an endurance race like fasted or like purely fat adapted during the race where I'm sticking to a low carbohydrate approach.
Mhm.
But we've had people on that have done it, and so we know that it's possible. We had a guy on that actually did it a sub 11-hour Ironman, eating nothing but 3 hard boiled eggs the entire day and electrolytes. So stuff is possible. It's just not taught. It's not common knowledge, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny, very similar parallels to my experience. It was running marathons that largely got
Yes.
me into podcasting and entrepreneurship, just because you kind of like you get that bug, and then all of a sudden you force yourself to do something that's very difficult, and you feel invincible sometimes after that experience. You kind of like you found that edge, and then you can keep pushing in cool directions. So I'm curious, how much sugar could you tolerate during some of those events?
My mindset going into the endurance events was always trying to, like, I tried to train fairly low carb. And then on the day of the race, I was probably hammering, anywhere from like 50 grams of sugar an hour to like 75 grams of sugar an hour. So I was my gut was, I trained enough with some sugar that it was ready to go. But
Mhm.
I always tried to get into that fat burning state just because my body just felt better. So I would try to delay my nutrition for like an hour into the race, and then start to really like, eat carbs. And at that point, you're burning fat and carbs equally. Your body doesn't really recognize it as either. You're fully burning
Mm.
both. So, you know, yeah, 50 to 75 grams of carbs an hour was kind of my go-to framework, and worked pretty well. I would say I was probably not perfect with my fueling during those days, but it's always something that I was tinkering with.
Abel, when you were racing, were you a low carb guy or would you incorporate sugar and kind of the traditional endurance fuel?
Yeah, I tried both. So I grew up running quite a bit and running cross country in high school and that sort of thing. And certainly wasn't low carb then. But once I was in my 20s, that's when I really started experimenting with intermittent fasting, longer endurance events, and low carb eating. But for the most part, especially if I was racing, I would that's where I would stack some of the carbs, and I would try to source them from something that wasn't traditional flours, and wouldn't wreck my gut. But at the same time, I wasn't afraid of the honey stingers and some of those goo packs or whatever. But I tried to stay away from the ones that were just like pure caffeine and chemicals and then high fructose corn syrup or whatever. There were garbage ones. But even back then, you could find pretty decent options that would allow you to fuel. But I think it's really important for people to experiment with not just that low carb carnivore approach, but also combining it with those physical activities. But because I think you kind of can't get the whole picture without each of those sides of it, right? It's like you have to understand glycogen and sugar and how that's stored and used if you're going to be pushing yourself that hard. So I know that it was extraordinarily instructive to me by experimenting with trying to like see when I would bonk. And for people who are listening who don't know what bonking is, it's basically just like underfueling carbs and running out of them at some point during an endurance event. And so you see grown men crying or crapping their pants or just running in the wrong direction because they lose their minds. Like bonking becomes ugly for a lot of people. And no matter how low carb I got, I never had a hard bonk. Sometimes I could feel myself approaching it a little bit, but it was more I think by embracing the low carb eating, going a little bit heavier on the meats and the proteins back then, that allowed me to kind of like build that separate gear that I feel like I still have in a lot of those events. I'm not going out and running marathons or doing triathlons right now, but you still kind of like have that gear that you can put into action.
Totally.
But I'm curious for you guys, how do you choose your next big challenge, especially together?
It's been a hodgepodge the last few years. I'm trying to remember the Habanero 100. I feel like Brett, you signed up for that one just kind of on a whim, and I was like, all right, I'm in.
I think I drank a strong espresso and just signed up on the spot.
Yeah, I think the honest answer is Brett gets overly caffeinated at like 6 a.m. and signs up for a race, and then I'm like, yep, let's do it.
Yeah,
Who has the
Harry's
advantage, the big guy or the small guy?
a better runner than I am.
Okay.
He crushes, yeah. But we did the habanero. We did the habanero together because one of the things that we also love to do is not necessarily train or prepare the best way. A little bit more of a mental kick in the balls that way. And Habanero 100, it's on a ranch outside of Houston, Texas. It's on the hottest time period in all of Texas, which is the middle of August, and they started it at 1:00 in the afternoon, so it's the hottest part of the day. And so this ranch was just a 6-mile track. And so we did the 100K distance, not the 100-mile distance. So, a little over 60 miles, but the actual footing of the race, it felt like the entire ground was covered in quicksand. So it was just sand. So you just couldn't get any traction. So to combine that ridiculous distance with the amount that we were sweating, not training on that, it was pretty ugly. But that was kind of a moment where if we didn't quit on each other after literally wanting to quit 100 times that day, it's like we can kind of do everything together. It's the feeling of like when you're about to public speak and you've got that nervousness to you and that excitement, that energy. It's almost like riding a roller coaster, but it's also really similar to the start of like some of the marathons that you've done, Abel, or an Ironman. So I think all this stuff just really translates. But typically the way that we sign up is something that's unique, something we haven't done before, something that would be like an unforgettable experience. And we haven't done a race together in about a year. And that's actually, it's a good reminder for us to take our own prescription and find something on the calendar that we can both do together, because, that's the backbone of everything that we're doing, is just finding these unforgettable experiences and pushing yourself. And there's always going to be something amazing on the other side of that.
Yeah. What about, you've got a lot of spinning plates between the two of you. How do you keep it all straight, and how do you prioritize between business, these athletic pursuits, podcasting, and all the rest of it?
The honest answer is having a great team around us, which has taken a really long time for, I think, Brett and myself to realize that that's kind of the key to getting a lot of things done and going after a lot of big goals is you can't do it alone.
Yeah.
And so I think early on that was clear. Like Brett and I had each other. We were able to like pour ourselves into the podcast, pour ourselves into the social media stuff. And as we've continued to build, we've really felt the need to bring people on. And sometimes it's been, our own stubbornness and kind of breaking things because we've taken on too many things. I think probably Brett and I would both totally agree that, we both like to take on more than we can handle. And I think that you learn the hard way pretty quickly when you're out there in the world of entrepreneurship and building things that you can't really get away with that. Focus and concentration is key. And if you're going to build anything of value. And so having a really strong team to cover your back, to cover your six on all the different things that you want to build is super important. So for us, we've broken things and messed up a million times, but ultimately when those things get fixed, it's relying on people and a team and learning that we have to delegate, we have to spread things out. And so we've gotten a little bit better at that over the last few years, but still a work in progress.
And what about you guys talk about God? You talk about how much that means to you in prayer and things like that. And for a lot of folks, especially outside of Texas, that can be a taboo subject to dig into, especially when the focus of the conversation for many people is elsewhere. But I'm curious, how does that affect your lives? How does that help you drive forward and make sure you're going in the right direction?
100%. I would say that like the practical answer is what Harry just gave. And then kind of like the more rooted answer would be just our spiritual practice and our relationship with God and Christ. And Harry and I, again, like just another similarity where, Harry grew up Episcopalian, I grew up Catholic. Like a lot of young men, we got away from the spirituality and our relationship with God going to college. I think, traditional Western university really like rips out God as part of the equation, which, we could probably spend a whole separate podcast talking about that. And I think, partially like getting our health under control, eating the right foods, I think it helps you really develop an antenna to God, which is probably the most important reason. Just your quality of thought, your confidence, you become a different man. And I think that allowed us to give us the confidence to start the podcast. And what Harry and I both realized is that the guests that we respected the most all mentioned their relationship with God.
Hmm.
And so for me, I just thought, well, if you're so smart, why are you unhappy? Why do you not have a relationship with God? And our triathlon coach, Natasha Vander Merwe, who runs NVDM coaching, she trained Nick Bear for his Ironmans. She's one of the best, if not the most prolific triathlon coach in the entire country. She saw the progression that Harry and I were on and pulled us to her small non-denominational church that she had been going to called Thrive. And once you get in the right community, man, with the right people, the right pastor, the right worship music, it's the sky's the limit. So, I don't think either of us are here to force it on anyone. It was just something that I think you just have to find that right community and that right church that speaks to you, and you'll get hit with it, and you'll know when you're in the right roof to worship God. But that's been the biggest difference maker for us over the last few years, more than anything. And I think partially we feel a responsibility through Meat Mafia to potentially help our listeners develop their own relationship with God as well.
Mm. Yeah, the only thing I could add to that too is we were talking the other day in our office. Spirituality in our faith comes up all the time in our office amongst the people who work with us, and there's definitely some level of differing opinions and beliefs in the office. But I do think that fighting that nature in the culture of it being taboo to talk about a topic so important as faith, the meaning of life, the core of our identity. Like these are questions that we should answer before we pursue almost any relationship, pursue any job. And if it's not like a full fledged, it's a progression. It's always an evolution. It's not, I've reached this point and now I'm good to go. You're always learning. And so I think Brett and I both have just fallen into the camp of these are really important conversations to have. Wear it on our sleeves. Don't be afraid of it. Be open-minded. Like walk into every conversation lovingly, but it's really important to talk about these things. And I don't see how we can build bridges if we're afraid to talk about our faith and what's important to us. So for us, just having gone through this transformation over the last 3 years of our faith, and really just a reinvigoration of connecting with God, it's really important for us to lead with that in some ways. If people are curious, it's just such a fun conversation to have. I mean, you can see walls being broken down right in front of your eyes just through being able to communicate with the right words into somebody's life. And I think that that skill, that gift, is something that is really like worth sharing. And I hope that it becomes less taboo to talk about it. It feels like that narrative is like, it's cast on us, like we shouldn't talk about these things, but it's such a fun topic, and I would encourage people to explore it.
Agreed. Yeah, and I'll just say too, because we only have a couple minutes left here, that anyone out there who needs another podcast to listen to, check out Meat Mafia, because you guys, there's a big difference between people who have a podcast and they just want to like go after big guests or whatever, and they ask the same questions as everyone else and just kind of like going down the list. Huge difference between that and what you guys are doing. Courageous conversations. You can tell that you're legitimately curious. And care about these things. Like, it's so important to care when you have these conversations, and the people on the other end of it can always tell. So kudos to you guys for doing that right. What is the best place for people to go to find the Meat Mafia podcast, Noble Origins, and everything else you're working on?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. I mean, you're a perfect testament to that too. Doing this for 13 years, people know you as the fat burning man, and I think we're very similar. Where it's like, well, it's not just nutrition. There's all these other interests that we want to blend together. And so, in full transparency, Harry and I have had conversations behind closed doors of, should it be the Meat Mafia podcast? Should it be something that encompasses our broader life philosophy? So I think time will tell, and I think we'll figure out what the right decision is. But for now, the Meat Mafia podcast, we're on Apple, Spotify, every major podcasting platform. We're on YouTube as well. We post all of our video interviews on YouTube. I am at Meat Mafia Brett on Twitter. Harry is at Meat Mafia Harry, which is where we post our rants, our soapbox moments. Probably the most unhinged content is going to be on Twitter. That's where we started too. So it's our favorite platform. And then we do have our nose to tail protein powder company as well, called Noble Origins, which is just nobleorigins.com. 25 grams of beef protein per scoop. We have a chocolate flavor, vanilla flavor. There's a little bit of collagen, some colostrum, some grass-fed organs in there too. So if you are interested in kind of developing that nose to tail approach, but want something that actually tastes delicious, that's why we made our supplement product. But yeah, man, those are the best places to reach us right now.
Right on. Brett, Harry, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Abel.
Thanks for having us, man. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for hanging out with us today on the show. Next up, we have some original music that I actually wrote with a past guest of this show, Mr. Denny Hemmingson, who's been the band leader of the Tim McGraw Band for about 2 decades now. He's a great friend of mine, an incredible musician, and I hope you dig this tune called Thank God for the Blues. Here we go.
Life weighs me down with complication, heavy troubles I can't carry very far. So I set my worries down and find salvation at that old back door, backstreet smoky bar. When I just need some sanctuary, when that cold, cruel world has knocked me to my knees, then you'll know just where you'll find me. I'll be right here singing songs of sweet release. And I thank God for the blues to heal my soul and set me free. Now sing it with me if your heart's been bruised. Thank God whiplash on that dusty, musty case. Raise that ragged lid and smell the years. Slide my fingers up those trusty, rusty strings. Let that old guitar cry my tears. And I thank God for the blues. Heal my soul, it set me free. Now sing it with me if your heart's been bruised. Thank God for the blues. And I thank God for the blues. To heal my soul, it set me free. Now sing it with me if your heart's been bruised.